A
Your
Navy
dog bit
SEAL
my brother's
stopped his
kid.
truck when he saw three hunters
put it
beating
down.
a starving German shepherd in the snow. He stepped in and saved the dog, thinking it was just the right thing to do. But days later, that same dog led him deep into the forest, straight to a man who had been missing for nearly a week. What the dog revealed next exposed a dangerous secret hidden in the wilderness, a secret that powerful men were willing to kill to keep buried. Sometimes the life you save becomes the one that saves many others. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories. Winter in Briar Glen, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, had a strange kind of brightness to it, so bright it almost hurt the eyes. Snow covered the forests in thick layers, resting quietly on tall pines and pale birch trunks like a heavy white blanket. Even the late afternoon sun reflected off the frozen ground in sharp silver flashes. To most people, the world looked peaceful, but winter in the north had never been truly gentle. A narrow forest road curved through the trees, almost erased beneath the snowfall. The only sign that anyone still traveled this way was the slow rumble of an aging pickup truck, moving carefully through the drifts. Behind the wheel sat Gideon Hart. At 34 years old, Gideon carried himself with the quiet stillness of someone trained to survive chaos. He stood about 6 feet tall, his frame lean and strong, not bulky, but built for endurance. His face was clean-shaven, the sharp lines of a square jaw and high cheekbones exposed to the cold air. Hair, dark brown and trimmed in a military cut slightly longer than a standard SEAL style, moved faintly whenever the heater pushed warm air across the cab. His skin was fair but weathered by years of ocean wind and northern deployments, and his eyes, gray with a faint blue tint, had the steady watchfulness of a man who noticed things other people missed. He wore the same clothes he had been wearing most of the drive north. An old olive-gray tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened with age, faintly frayed at the shoulders and wrists. A pair of worn earth-brown combat pants hung slightly loose, the cargo pockets sagging just enough to show they had been used for years. His military work boots rested lightly on the pedals, and a scratched old military watch sat against his wrist. Gideon had only been back in the United States for 3 days. 3 days since a long deployment ended somewhere far from snow and pine forests. Most soldiers celebrated coming home. Gideon drove north instead. The cabin waiting for him deep in these woods had been his quiet refuge for years, a place where the silence felt honest. The tires crunched softly over ice. For a long time there was nothing but the steady rhythm of snow falling through the trees. Then Gideon noticed something unusual ahead: movement. His eyes narrowed slightly. He slowed the truck. At first, it looked like shadows shifting between the trees. But then shapes began to form through the pale curtain of snow. 3 men stood beside the road near an old hunting clearing, and something moved between them. Gideon eased off the gas pedal. As the truck rolled closer, the scene sharpened into focus. A German shepherd struggled in the deep snow. The dog looked thin, far thinner than a healthy shepherd should be. Her thick coat of yellow and black fur was matted with ice, the dark saddle along her back almost blending into the winter shadows. Her ribs were faintly visible beneath the coat, and one of her back legs dragged slightly with each desperate step. She was trying to escape, but the snow was too deep. One of the men shoved her with the wooden butt of a rifle. She fell sideways into the drift. Another man laughed. The sound echoed strangely in the frozen air. These weren't casual hunters. Their gear told the story immediately. The first man, tall and heavy-set with a red beard and a thick brown hunting jacket, held his rifle loosely like he had used it more than a few times. His face carried the restless irritation of someone used to forcing things to go his way. Beside him stood a thinner man wearing a faded camouflage coat and a black knit cap pulled low over his brow. His cheekbones were sharp, and his narrow eyes darted constantly toward the surrounding trees as if he feared being watched. The third man was younger, barely 30, broad-shouldered with rough stubble along his jaw. He carried a coil of steel trap wire in one hand. The dog scrambled back, to her feet. One of the men kicked Snow toward her. "Damn mutt's been wrecking our traps all week," the bearded man muttered. "She's been circling the line every night," the thinner man added, "scaring off half the animals." The younger man lifted his rifle. "If she keeps barking when trucks pass through, someone's gonna follow the noise sooner or later." The message was clear. The dog wasn't just an inconvenience. She was a risk. The barrel of the rifle rose slowly. Inside the truck, Gideon's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. For a moment, something deep inside him shifted. A memory. A different dog. A different battlefield. A pair of brown eyes that had once trusted him completely. The past didn't speak often in Gideon's mind, but when it did, it carried weight. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence startled the men. The truck door opened. Cold wind rushed into the cab as Gideon stepped onto the road. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The hunters turned toward him. The bearded man squinted. "Road's closed today," he said flatly. Gideon didn't answer. His gaze moved past them. The dog had stopped moving. She stood trembling in the snow, ears partially lowered, watching him carefully. Up close, Gideon could see the details. She wasn't young anymore, probably 4 or 5 years old. Her muzzle was darker than the rest of her coat, and a small scar ran along her right shoulder. Her eyes were amber, not wild, not empty, just tired and waiting. The wind shifted suddenly through the trees. For a brief second, the dog did something strange. She didn't run. She didn't snarl. Instead, she looked straight at Gideon, then slowly glanced back toward the deeper forest behind the hunters, then back to him again. Almost like she was trying to say something. The moment lasted less than a heartbeat, but Gideon noticed, and something about that small gesture tightened the air between them. "Look," the bearded hunter said impatiently. "You want to keep driving, soldier boy? Go ahead." His tone carried the careless arrogance of someone who believed he owned the ground beneath his boots. "But this ain't your problem." Gideon took a few steps closer. His posture remained calm, but calm in a Navy SEAL didn't mean harmless. "You don't need to shoot the dog," Gideon said quietly. The younger hunter scoffed. "You know what this mutt's been doing?" "Yeah," the bearded man added. "She's been tearing up our traps, scaring every animal off the line, and barking whenever a vehicle comes through." The thinner man spat into the snow. "Last thing we need is some ranger sniffing around." Gideon's expression didn't change. "Sounds like illegal traps," he said. The younger man's jaw tightened. "Sounds like you should mind your business." Snow fell harder now. Silence stretched between them. The rifle barrel rose again. That was when Gideon moved. The motion was fast enough that none of them saw it begin. He stepped forward, grabbing the younger man's wrist before the trigger finger could tighten. The rifle twisted sideways as Gideon redirected the momentum. The man crashed into the snow. The second hunter lunged forward. 2 seconds later, he was face down beside his friend. The bearded man hesitated. He looked at the two men groaning in the snow. Then, at Gideon. Something in Gideon's eyes convinced him not to try anything else. "You're gonna regret this," the man muttered. He grabbed his companions and backed away toward the trees. Before disappearing into the forest, he turned once more. "That dog's been wrecking our work for weeks," he said coldly. "If you keep her, you'll become part of the problem." Then they were gone. The forest swallowed them. Snow drifted quietly back into the clearing. Gideon stood still for a moment. Then he turned slowly toward the dog. She hadn't moved. Her body trembled from cold and exhaustion, but she was still standing. Gideon crouched carefully. "Easy," he murmured. The dog watched him. Her ears twitched once. She took a cautious step forward, then stopped. Trust didn't come easily. Gideon knew that better than anyone. He stood up and walked back to the truck. He opened the passenger door, then stepped away. The dog hesitated. Wind moved through the trees. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the shepherd slowly approached the truck. She sniffed the open door, looked once more toward the forest behind them, and finally climbed inside. Gideon closed the door gently. As the engine started again, the dog settled quietly on the seat. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the silent forests of Briar Glen. Neither of them knew it yet, but something far larger than a winter accident had just begun. The cabin stood quietly at the edge of the forest, half hidden beneath a ridge of white drifts and towering pine trees that had watched over this stretch of land long before Briar Glen existed. It was a simple structure, built of thick cedar logs darkened by years of winter storms. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, its railing buried beneath snow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, where a banked fire still burned inside. For Gideon Hart, the place had always been less of a house and more of a refuge. The forest did not ask questions, and it never judged a man for the silence he carried with him. When Gideon opened the passenger door of the truck, the German shepherd hesitated before stepping down. Her paws touched the snow carefully, as if she expected something to strike her again. She stood still for several seconds. The cold wind shifted the fur along her back, revealing the shape of her ribs beneath the yellow and black coat. Up close, the dog looked even thinner than Gideon had realized. Her fur was the classic shepherd pattern, a deep black saddle across her back fading into golden tan along her legs and chest. Her ears were tall and alert, though one of them carried a faint notch near the edge, likely from an old injury. She was not young, but not old either. 4, maybe 5 years. Her amber eyes followed Gideon as he walked toward the cabin door. She didn't trust him yet, but she had chosen not to leave. That alone meant something. Inside, the cabin was warm and dim, lit by the orange glow of a stone fireplace that had been left burning low before Gideon left for his deployment months earlier. The smell of cedar wood and iron filled the room. Gideon moved quietly, setting a small metal bowl near the kitchen counter. He filled it with water. Then he opened a container of dried venison strips from a cupboard. The dog had not followed him inside yet. She remained at the doorway, watching every movement. "Suit yourself," Gideon said calmly. His voice carried the steady patience of someone used to waiting. The dog stepped forward slowly. Her paws made soft sounds against the wooden floor. She sniffed the air first, then the water. She drank carefully, pausing between gulps, as though unsure whether the moment might suddenly end. When she finished, Gideon crouched a few feet away, Let's try something else, he said quietly. He placed the venison on the floor and stepped back. The shepherd approached cautiously. Her nose twitched. Then she ate. Not quickly, not greedily, but steadily. Gideon studied her while she ate. One of her back legs carried a faint stiffness when she shifted her weight. There were marks around her neck, faint indentations in the fur where a rope or chain had once rubbed the skin raw. He had seen that kind of mark before. Animals tied too long, animals forgotten. "Yeah," Gideon murmured under his breath. "You've had a rough time." The dog finished eating. Then she stepped away and circled the room slowly. Her movements were careful, alert. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the door. Then finally, she lay down on the rug near the entrance. Not beside the fire, not near Gideon, but close enough to watch him. Gideon leaned back against the kitchen counter. "You'll need a name," he said. The dog lifted her head slightly. He studied her coat again, the deep black fur across her back like a shadow resting on snow. "Sable," he said after a moment. The dog blinked. Maybe it meant nothing to her. Maybe it did. But the name felt right. The first night passed quietly, too quietly. Gideon woke sometime after midnight. The cabin was dark except for faint embers glowing in the fireplace. For a moment he thought a dream had pulled him awake. Then he heard it, the soft shifting of claws on wood. Sable was sitting upright near the door. Her ears were high and rigid. She wasn't barking. She wasn't growling. She was listening. Listening with the focused stillness of an animal tuned to something distant in the forest. Gideon sat up slowly in his chair. "What is it?" The dog did not move. She stared toward the dark trees beyond the door. Minutes passed. Nothing came. Eventually, her ears relaxed. She lay down again. But Gideon didn't fall asleep easily after that. Something about the moment lingered. Not fear, not danger exactly. Just the feeling that the forest outside had tried to say something, and then changed its mind. Over the next few days, Sable began to settle into a routine. She remained cautious, but the distance between her and Gideon gradually shrank. She followed him outside when he chopped wood. She watched him when he repaired a section of broken fence along the tree line. But she never wandered far from the forest path leading north. Each morning she walked the same direction, 30 yards, sometimes 50, then she stopped. She looked back. If Gideon did not follow, she returned to the cabin. It happened often enough that Gideon began noticing the pattern. "You trying to tell me something?" he asked one afternoon. Sable simply tilted her head. 4 days later, Gideon drove into Briar Glen. The town sat in a shallow valley surrounded by thick forests and frozen hills. In winter, it looked almost like a painting. Small wooden buildings, snow-covered roofs, and a narrow road cutting through the center. Most people in Briar Glen knew Gideon Hart. Not well, but enough. He parked beside a modest storefront with a wooden sign reading, "Pierce General Store and Post." A brass bell rang when he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Evelyn Pierce. Evelyn was 39, tall and slender with a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Her chestnut brown hair fell just past her shoulders, often tied loosely at the back with a leather band. A few strands had escaped the tie, today resting against the pale freckles across her cheeks. Her eyes were warm brown, observant, but kind. Years earlier, she had lost her husband in a winter logging accident. Since then, she had kept the small store running alone, helping half the town with mail deliveries, supplies, and sometimes simply conversation. Loss had softened her voice but strengthened her patience. She looked up when Gideon entered. "Well," she said with a small smile, "the ghost of Briar Glen returns." Gideon shrugged slightly. "Needed groceries." "You always say that like groceries are the only reason anyone comes into town." Her eyes moved briefly toward the door behind him. "You bring a dog?" "Left her outside." Evelyn stepped to the window. A moment later, she returned. "German Shepherd," she said. "Yeah." "She yours?" "Not exactly." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That kind of dog usually belongs to someone." She began gathering supplies Gideon had written on a list. While she worked, two older men near the stove were speaking quietly. "Still no sign of him," one muttered. The other shook his head. "Lucas should have checked in by now." Evelyn glanced toward Gideon. "You heard about Lucas Hale?" Gideon shook his head. "Forest ranger," she said. "Good kid. Works the northern ridges. Hasn't come back in almost a week." The older men exchanged uneasy looks. "Been hearing shots in the woods at night," one added. "Not hunting season." The other leaned closer. "Crow's men been up there again." The name hung in the air for a moment. Wyatt Crow. Even people who avoided trouble knew it. Crow had hunted these forests longer than most people in town had lived here. Some said he knew every ridge and creek by heart. Others said he knew how to avoid questions. Evelyn lowered her voice slightly. "Sheriff's looking into it," she said. But her tone carried doubt. Gideon paid for the groceries and stepped back outside. Sable stood beside the truck exactly where he had left her. Her tail lifted slightly when she saw him. But the moment he opened the door, she turned, not toward the cabin road, toward the forest. Sable stopped in the snow. She looked into the trees ahead. Then she began digging, not randomly, deliberately. Snow sprayed backward beneath her paws as she uncovered something buried beneath the drift. Gideon stepped closer. Within seconds, her claws struck fabric. He knelt beside her, carefully brushing away the snow. A dark green glove appeared, heavy material. Government issue. The kind forest rangers wore during winter patrols. One finger of the glove was stiff with frozen blood. Sable stopped digging. She stepped back, then looked at Gideon again. The same steady look. Not wild, not pleading, just waiting. Gideon lifted the glove slowly. The cold metal badge stitched into the fabric caught the light. The forest around them had gone completely silent. Gideon scanned the trees carefully. No footprints remained. The snowfall had erased everything, but one thing was clear. Someone had been here before the storm. Someone who had not walked away easily. Sable stood beside him in the snow, watching, as if she had already known he would find it, and as if she had been trying to bring someone here. For a very long time. Morning arrived in Briar Glen, the way northern mornings often did in winter. Quiet, pale, and cold enough to turn breath into silver mist. The sky was clear for the first time in several days. Sunlight spilled across the frozen valley and crept slowly through the pine forests that surrounded the town like a silent wall. Inside the cabin, Gideon Hart stood near the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. Across the room, Sable lay stretched beside the fireplace. In daylight, she looked less like a shadow from the woods and more like what she truly was. A German shepherd of strong working bloodlines, even if hardship had carved sharp lines into her body. The black saddle across her back stood out clearly now, and the tan fur along her chest had begun to regain some of its warmth after several days of regular food. But her ribs were still visible, and when she stood, the stiffness in her back leg remained. Gideon watched her carefully. She wasn't just a stray dog wandering through the snow. She had purpose. He had seen that kind of focus before. Military working dogs carried it. Search dogs carried it. Animals trained to follow a scent long after humans would have given up. When Gideon finished his coffee, he pulled on his jacket. Sable lifted her head. "You coming?" he asked. Her ears rose immediately. The sheriff's office sat near the center of Briar Glen, beside the small courthouse and a snow-covered flagpole that creaked softly in the wind. The building itself was plain. Brick walls darkened by decades of winter storms. A wooden sign hanging above the door that read, "Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and old paperwork." Behind a desk near the back of the room sat Sheriff Nolan Voss. Nolan Voss was a tall man, nearly 6'3", with broad shoulders that had thickened with age. His hair had once been dark, but now carried more gray than black, cut short in a style that suggested practicality rather than fashion. A short beard framed his square jaw, the silver strands catching the light from the window behind him. His eyes were pale blue and steady, eyes that had watched the valley change for nearly 3 decades. Before becoming sheriff, Nolan had spent years as a state trooper patrolling the highways of northern Michigan. A brutal winter crash 15 years earlier had taken the life of his partner during a roadside rescue, and since then, Nolan carried a quiet caution about rushing into situations without clear evidence. He looked up when Gideon entered. "You're back earlier than usual," Nolan said. His voice was calm, roughened by years of cold air and long nights. Gideon set the glove on the desk. Nolan studied it carefully. The sheriff's expression didn't change much, but Gideon noticed the tightening at the corner of his mouth. "Lucas Hales," Nolan said quietly. "You sure?" "Yeah." Nolan leaned back in his chair. Lucas Hale had arrived in Briar Glen a year earlier as a forest ranger assigned to patrol the northern ridges. He was 31 years old, tall and lean with sun-browned skin and sandy blonde hair that usually stuck out from beneath his ranger hat. Lucas carried himself with the restless energy of someone who loved the outdoors more than buildings. He also had a reputation for being stubborn. If he suspected illegal hunting, he wouldn't look the other way. Nolan folded his hands on the desk. "Problem is," he said, "these woods stretch for 50 miles in every direction." He glanced toward Sable, sitting beside Gideon. "You're saying the dog led you to this?" Gideon nodded. "She keeps going back to the same area." Nolan sighed. "And you think Crow's crew has something to do with it?" Gideon didn't answer directly, but his silence carried its own meaning. Nolan stood slowly. "Look," he said, stepping around the desk. "Wyatt Crow's been hunting these forests longer than I've been sheriff. That doesn't make him innocent." "No," Nolan replied quietly, "but it means I need proof before I start kicking down doors." He looked down at the glove again. "Still," Nolan added, "if Lucas left this behind, something happened." Nolan grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. "I'll run this through the system." "Meanwhile," he said, glancing at Gideon, "don't go playing hero out there." Gideon almost smiled. By midday, the sky had turned bright, and the snowfields beyond the cabin shone like glass. Gideon parked his truck near the edge of the forest and stepped out. Sable jumped down beside him. She didn't wait for instructions. Her nose lowered immediately to the snow. The trail she followed wasn't visible to human eyes, but she moved with quiet certainty. Gideon followed at a steady distance. At first, the path led along a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen creek. Then Sable turned sharply into a section of forest where the pine trees grew closer together. The deeper they walked, the quieter the forest became. Snow absorbed sound so completely that even Gideon's boots seemed to vanish beneath it. After nearly an hour of walking, Sable slowed. She circled a patch of ground once, then twice. Then she moved toward a cluster of fallen branches half buried in the snow. Gideon brushed the branches aside. Beneath them sat the remains of a small wooden structure, a hunting cabin, old, abandoned, at least at first glance. He pushed the door open carefully. The hinges groaned. Inside, the air smelled stale. Dust covered the floor, but the place hadn't been abandoned for long. A table stood near the back wall, and on it sat several items: steel trap wires, bundles of animal pelts, a folded forest map. Gideon studied the map closely. Small circles had been marked in red ink across the northern region. Coordinates, supply points, trap lines, illegal ones, the kind that could bring heavy federal charges. He flipped open a small notebook lying beside the map. Inside were rows of numbers, dates, times, delivery routes. This wasn't a casual hunting operation. It was organized. Sable suddenly froze. Her ears lifted. But instead of growling or barking, she walked slowly toward the far corner of the cabin. She lowered her nose beneath the table. Then she stopped. Her body went completely still. Gideon stepped closer. At first he saw nothing, then he crouched. Under the table lay a piece of leather, a collar, old, weathered. Gideon picked it up. The leather had cracked slightly with age, but the inside surface carried a faint carving, hand-etched. 2 words: Sable. For a long moment, Gideon didn't move. The dog stood beside him, staring at the collar. Her tail did not wag. She simply watched it. Not like an animal discovering something new, but like someone recognizing something lost. Gideon exhaled slowly. "Well," he murmured, "you're not a stray after all." The collar suggested something else, too. Someone had named her. Someone had cared enough to carve the name by hand, and that someone had likely been nearby not long ago. Sable turned toward the doorway, her ears tilted again toward the deeper forest. The wind outside shifted gently through the pine trees. Gideon slipped the collar into his pocket. Whatever had happened here, Sable had not wandered into his life by accident. And somewhere in the vast winter forest beyond the cabin, the truth about Lucas Hale and the men who hunted these woods was waiting. The morning air carried a sharp stillness that only northern winters knew. Frost clung to the cabin windows like thin lace as Gideon Hart stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a quiet wooden thud. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a crust that cracked softly under his boots. Sable was already waiting at the edge of the clearing. The German shepherd stood alert, her lean frame outlined against the pale light of early morning. Her coat, black across the back and warm gold along her chest and legs, seemed darker against the endless white landscape. The old leather collar Gideon had found the day before now rested loosely around her neck. It fit, not perfectly, but close enough. She turned her head when Gideon approached, amber eyes watching him with the same quiet patience she had shown since the day they met. There was something different in her posture now. Not fear, expectation. Gideon crouched beside her, adjusting the strap. "You remember this thing, don't you?" Sable's ears twitched slightly. Then she turned her head toward the forest, the direction she had been watching every morning. Gideon stood slowly. "All right," he murmured. "Let's go." The sheriff's truck appeared on the narrow forest road less than 20 minutes later. The vehicle moved carefully through the snow, its dark green body dusted white along the hood and roof. When it stopped, Sheriff Nolan Voss stepped out first. He wore a thick navy winter coat and a gray wool cap pulled low over his ears. His tall frame seemed even broader beneath the heavy fabric. The silver threads in his beard caught the pale sunlight as he scanned the surrounding forest. Behind him climbed out a second figure, a teenager. Micah Bell was 16 years old and looked younger when he smiled, though today his expression carried a seriousness that didn't quite belong to someone his age. He was tall for a boy his age, already close to Gideon's height, but still thin, with long arms and shoulders that had not fully filled out yet. Sandy blonde hair fell across his forehead beneath a knitted hat that had clearly been repaired several times. Micah lived with his grandfather on a small property at the northern edge of Briar Glen. His father had died in a logging accident when Micah was 9, and since then the boy had grown up learning the forest trails the way other kids learned city streets. If there was anyone in town who could move through these woods without getting lost, it was Micah. He glanced at Sable with curiosity. "That the dog?" he asked. Gideon nodded. Micah crouched slightly, studying her. "She looks like she's been through hell." Sable simply watched him. Micah stood again. "Sheriff says she's been leading you somewhere." Gideon looked toward the trees. "That's the idea." Sheriff Nolan exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "let's see where she wants to go." The forest swallowed them quickly. Tall pines crowded together above the trail, their branches heavy with snow. Sunlight filtered through in narrow silver beams, illuminating drifting flakes that fell whenever the wind stirred. Sable moved ahead of them with quiet purpose. Her nose skimmed the snow. Every few minutes she paused, adjusting direction slightly before continuing. Micah watched her with growing interest. "She's tracking something," he said. Gideon nodded. "Or someone." The deeper they walked, the steeper the terrain became. Rock ridges pushed up through the snow in dark shapes, and narrow gullies cut across the forest floor. Nearly an hour passed before Sable slowed. She circled a cluster of large granite boulders where the snow had collapsed inward slightly. Gideon felt it immediately. Something about the place was different. The air felt heavier. He moved closer. The hollow between the rocks formed a narrow depression, half hidden by drifting snow. Then Sable stopped. She stared directly into the opening, her tail lowered slightly, not in fear, in recognition. Before Gideon could step closer, Sable let out a sound none of them had heard from her before. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was a low, trembling whine. The kind of sound a dog makes when it recognizes someone it thought it had lost. The moment hung in the cold air. Sheriff Nolan froze. Micah's eyes widened. Gideon moved forward carefully. Inside the narrow rock hollow, something shifted. Then a voice, thin and hoarse, scraped against the silence. "Sable?" Gideon dropped to one knee. Inside the shallow stone shelter lay a man wrapped in a torn ranger jacket. Lucas Hale looked older than 31 now. His sandy blonde hair had grown tangled beneath a wool cap that was pulled low over his forehead. A rough beard covered his jaw, giving him a gaunt, exhausted look. His face was pale beneath the windburn, and his lips were cracked from days of cold air. One arm was wrapped tightly in a strip of cloth that had once been part of his uniform shirt. Blood had frozen into the fabric, but his eyes, green and sharp despite the exhaustion, were open and focused on the dog. Sable stepped forward slowly. Lucas tried to sit up, failed, but he smiled anyway. "Thought you left," he whispered. Sable moved closer and pressed her nose gently against his shoulder. For the first time since Gideon had found her, the shepherd's tail wagged. Sheriff Nolan crouched beside them. "Lucas," he said firmly. "You with us?" Lucas nodded weakly. "Yeah. How long you been down here?" Lucas blinked slowly. 6, maybe 7 days. Micah's jaw dropped. 7? Lucas gave a faint laugh that turned into a cough. Lost track after the 3rd night. Gideon examined the shelter carefully. The hollow beneath the rocks was barely large enough for a person to lie down, but it blocked most of the wind. Blackened stones near the entrance showed where Lucas had built small fires. "Smart," Gideon said quietly. Lucas shrugged weakly. "Forest Service training." He looked down at Sable again. "She's the reason I'm still breathing." Sheriff Nolan frowned. "What happened out here, Lucas?" The ranger's expression darkened. "I found Crow's trap lines north of the ridge," he said. "Steel jaw traps, dozens of them." Micah cursed under his breath. Lucas continued slowly. "I started documenting them, taking coordinates." He swallowed. 2 nights later, I heard a snowmobile. Crow's men. Gideon's eyes hardened. They jumped me before I could radio it in. Lucas lifted his injured arm slightly. "Got one good swing in before they knocked me down." He looked at Sable again. "She bit one of them." The shepherd lowered her head slightly. Lucas smiled faintly. "They were going to leave me there." He paused. "But she wouldn't run." Gideon listened carefully. "What happened after that?" Lucas's voice grew softer. "I crawled here. Couldn't move much after that." He gestured weakly toward the forest. "Every night she disappeared." Micah leaned closer. "Where'd she go?" Lucas's tired eyes flicked toward the trees. "The hunting cabin." Gideon understood immediately, the abandoned structure they had found. "She brought food," Lucas continued. "Not much. Jerky, scraps. But enough." His voice cracked slightly. "That dog kept me alive." Sable lay beside him now, her body pressed gently against his side as if trying to share warmth. Lucas scratched behind her ear weakly. "Good girl," he whispered. Gideon glanced toward Sheriff Nolan. "We need to move him." Nolan nodded. Micah had already started clearing snow to widen the entrance of the rock hollow. Together, they carefully lifted Lucas. He winced, but stayed conscious. The walk back would take time, but Lucas Hale was alive. And for the first time since Gideon had stepped into these woods with the strange shepherd at his side, the mystery surrounding her began to make sense. Sable had not been wandering. She had been waiting for someone who could follow where she led. The sun rose cold and brilliant over the frozen valley of Briar Glen. Winter light in the northern woods had a peculiar intensity. It reflected off the snow with such brightness that the world seemed carved from glass and silver. The pines stood tall and motionless beneath the pale sky, their branches heavy with frost. From a distance, the forest looked peaceful, but Gideon Hart knew better. Some of the quietest places in the world were also the most dangerous. 2 days had passed since they found Lucas Hale alive beneath the stone shelter in the ridge. Lucas now lay in a hospital bed in Marquette, weak but stable. Sheriff Nolan Voss had driven him there personally, refusing to trust anyone else with the injured ranger's safety. And before leaving, Lucas had shared everything he knew. Coordinates, trap routes, storage points, hidden paths through the forest used by Wyatt Crow and his men. Now those pieces of information had turned the quiet investigation into something far more serious. Sheriff Nolan had enough to start building a case, but the woods of northern Michigan had always been slow to surrender their secrets. Sometimes the forest fought back. Late morning sunlight spilled across the frozen surface of a small lake nearly 10 miles north of Briar Glen. The lake had no official name. Locals simply called it White Mirror because on calm winter days the ice reflected the sky so clearly it seemed endless. Sheriff Nolan's truck sat near the tree line at the southern edge. Beside it stood Gideon. He had traded his usual combat shirt for a heavier olive jacket, but the worn combat pants and old military boots remained the same. The cold wind pushed lightly against his dark hair, which had grown slightly longer since his deployment. Sable stood beside him. The German Shepherd looked stronger now after several days of regular food and warmth, though her lean frame still carried signs of hardship. Her yellow-black coat gleamed under the Awaka winter sun, and the leather collar around her neck rested naturally against the thick fur. Her ears were upright, her attention fixed on the far side of the frozen lake. Sheriff Nolan stepped out of the truck. "Lucas was right about the coordinates," he said. His voice was low, thoughtful. Nolan held a folded map in one gloved hand. Several red circles marked locations across the northern forest. "We checked 3 sites already," he continued. "Trap lines, pelts, equipment." Gideon nodded. "And Crow?" Nolan's mouth tightened slightly. "Gone every time." That was the problem. Wyatt Crow had been operating in these woods for years, long enough to know how to vanish when someone started asking questions. But the evidence was building. Sooner or later, Crow would have to make a move. Sheriff Nolan turned toward the frozen lake. "Lucas marked another storage point across the ridge," he said. "Old supply cabin." Gideon glanced toward the swamp trees. "You think they'll still be using it?" Nolan shrugged. "If they're smart, no." He folded the map and slid it into his coat. "But men like Crow don't stop easily." Sable suddenly moved. Not running, not barking, just walking forward onto the frozen lake with quiet determination. Gideon followed. The ice beneath their boots groaned faintly but held firm. Halfway across the lake, the wind strengthened, sending fine snow skimming across the surface like pale mist. Everything looked endless and empty. But Sable slowed. Her head lifted, her nose twitched, then her body stiffened. Without warning, Sable lunged sideways. Her teeth caught the sleeve of Gideon's jacket and yanked hard. The movement knocked him backward just as a sharp crack split the air. A bullet struck the trunk of a pine tree exactly where Gideon had been standing a heartbeat earlier. Wood splintered. Snow exploded from the branch above. Sheriff Nolan dove behind a fallen log. "Sniper!" he shouted. Another shot echoed across the lake. The sound rolled through the forest like distant thunder. Gideon hit the snow hard, but rolled immediately behind a ridge of ice near the shoreline. His military instincts moved faster than conscious thought. Years of training took control. He scanned the tree line carefully. The shooter had fired from somewhere within the northern woods, but the sunlight reflecting off the snow made it nearly impossible to see movement. Sheriff Nolan crawled beside him. "You all right?" Gideon nodded. "Yeah." He glanced at Sable. The dog crouched low beside them, ears pinned forward, eyes scanning the forest. Her muscles trembled, not from fear but from intense focus. "She heard him first," Gideon said quietly. Nolan exhaled. "Well then," he muttered. "Looks like Crow found out we're looking." Another shot cracked through the trees. The bullet struck the ice 30 yards away, sending shards of frozen water flying. "Move!" Nolan ordered. They sprinted for the tree line. Snow sprayed beneath their boots as they ran into the cover of the forest. The moment the trees surrounded them, the world changed. Visibility dropped. The snow softened sound. Gideon pressed his back against a thick pine trunk. "He's not alone," Nolan said. "How do you know?" "Crow never works alone." As if confirming the thought, a distant engine roared somewhere deeper in the woods, a snowmobile, then another. Gideon's jaw tightened. "They're pulling out." "Or circling," Nolan replied. Sable suddenly bolted forward into the trees. "Wait!" Gideon called. But the dog was already moving fast. He ran after her. Branches whipped past his shoulders as he pushed through the forest. Sable followed a narrow path barely visible beneath the snow. After several hundred yards, she slowed, then stopped. Ahead stood a small wooden structure half buried beneath. Drifting snow. A storage shed. One of the coordinates Lucas had marked. The door hung partially open. Sheriff Nolan arrived seconds later, breathing heavily. "Think they left something behind?" he asked. Gideon stepped inside carefully. The air smelled strongly of animal hides. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls. Inside them were pelts, wolf, fox, lynx, illegal, every one of them. Sheriff Nolan shook his head slowly. "Enough here to bury Crow." But Gideon's attention was elsewhere. Near the back wall lay several steel traps, large ones, designed for wolves. One trap still carried dark stains of dried blood. Sable approached them cautiously. She sniffed the metal. Then she backed away, ears lowering. Understanding struck Gideon instantly. "These traps," he said quietly. "They're why Crow wanted her dead." Nolan looked at the dog. "You mean she was setting them off?" Gideon nodded. She was ruining his lines. The sheriff exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "guess we know why they chased her." Outside, the wind picked up again. Snow began drifting through the open doorway. Gideon stepped back into the cold sunlight. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Somewhere beyond those trees, Wyatt Crow and his men were disappearing deeper into the wilderness. But they had made one mistake. They had revealed themselves, and now Gideon Hart knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. Beside him, Sable stood quietly in the snow, watching the forest, waiting. The wind began rising again the morning the manhunt started. In the northern woods of Michigan, wind did not simply move the air, it carried the voice of the forest itself. Snow lifted in thin, ghost-like spirals between the pines, and the sky hung low and gray as though the clouds had come down to watch. Outside the Briar Glen Sheriff's Office, several vehicles idled in the cold. Sheriff Nolan Voss stood beside the hood of his truck, studying a map spread across the metal surface. His tall frame was wrapped in a thick winter coat. His silver-streaked beard dusted lightly with frost. Around him stood 3 deputies from neighboring counties, men used to harsh winters and long hours in the wilderness. One of them, Deputy Aaron Pike, was the youngest. Aaron Pike was 32, broad-shouldered with a rugged face that still held the stubborn energy of a former rodeo rider. A faint scar curved along his jawline, a reminder of a bull that had nearly crushed him years ago before he left that life behind and joined law enforcement. His brown hair was hidden beneath a dark wool cap, and his sharp hazel eyes scanned the forest road constantly. "They've got maybe a 6-hour head start," Pike said. Nolan nodded slowly. "Crow knows these woods," he replied, "but he also knows we're coming." Across the parking lot, Gideon Hart leaned against the side of Nolan's truck. The cold wind pressed lightly against his worn olive jacket. Beneath it, his old tactical combat shirt and weathered combat pants carried the same quiet practicality he had worn for years in far harsher environments. Beside him sat Sable. The German shepherd looked stronger now than the day he had found her. Her black saddle gleamed across her back, and the golden fur along her chest had begun to thicken again. But there was still a leanness to her body, a survivor's build. Her amber eyes remained fixed on the forest road ahead, waiting, as if she already knew the chase had begun. Crow and his men had fled sometime during the night. Lucas Hale's testimony, combined with the evidence from the storage site, had given Sheriff Nolan everything he needed to move. But Crow had friends. Someone had warned him. By dawn, the poachers were already heading north through the winter trails, snowmobiles carving narrow paths through the forest. The pursuit began shortly after sunrise. Snowmobiles from the sheriff's office roared through the frozen trees, their engines echoing across the valleys. The cold air bit into exposed skin, and the wind whipped snow into the riders' faces. Gideon rode beside Nolan. Sable ran ahead of them. She moved through the forest with astonishing speed, her paws barely touching the snow as she followed the faint scent trail left by the fleeing men. Deputy Pike rode slightly behind them. "How the hell does that dog keep up?" he shouted over the engine noise. Gideon's voice came through the wind. "She's been running these woods longer than we have." The trail twisted deeper into the mountains. Steep ridges forced them to slow. The tracks of Crow's machines cut through the snow like scars. But eventually, the machines could go no farther. The terrain grew too rough. The rest of the chase would be on foot. The forest here was older. Massive pines towered overhead, their trunks thick as stone pillars. Snow lay deep between them, untouched except for the fresh tracks ahead. Crow and his men were running, but they weren't panicking. Their path followed a narrow ridge that wound toward a frozen creek. "They're heading for the old logging road," Nolan said quietly. "If they reach it, they can disappear into Canada." Gideon nodded. "Then we don't let them reach it." Sable suddenly slowed. Her ears rose sharply. She looked ahead toward the trees, then toward Gideon. Her tail lowered. Something had changed. The forest fell silent, not the natural quiet of winter, a deeper stillness. Even the wind seemed to pause. Sable stepped forward cautiously. Then she stopped. Her body stiffened. Gideon noticed it instantly, the subtle tension in her posture, the slight tilt of her head as she studied the narrow path ahead. He followed her gaze. Across the creek lay a narrow wooden bridge, an old structure built decades ago during the logging era. It looked fragile, half-rotted. Snow covered most of the boards, but something about it felt wrong. Then Gideon saw the wire, thin, nearly invisible, running across one of the support beams, a trap, and at that exact moment, the bridge groaned. "Back!" Gideon shouted, but it was too late. The front beam of the bridge snapped. The entire structure collapsed with a violent crack. Wood splintered. Ice shattered. Gideon lunged backward, but his boot slipped on the snow-covered edge of the creek. The frozen surface beneath him cracked open. For a terrifying second, he felt himself falling toward the jagged ice below. Then Sable slammed into him. The dog's body hit his chest with full force, knocking him sideways away from the collapsing edge. They both rolled across the snow as the bridge collapsed into the frozen water. The impact stole Gideon's breath, but he was alive. Sheriff Nolan rushed forward. "You all right?" Gideon nodded, breathing hard. Then he looked down. Sable lay beside him, her front leg twisted awkwardly. The fall had sent her sliding across the ice before she could stop. A low whimper escaped her throat. Gideon's chest tightened. "Easy, girl," he murmured. Her amber eyes lifted to meet his. She tried to stand, but the injured leg buckled. The calm control Gideon carried in battle shifted into something colder. Anger, not loud, not wild, just focused. He rose slowly. Across the creek, fresh tracks continued into the forest. Crow had crossed earlier using the bridge before rigging the trap. Behind him, he had expected pursuit. He had hoped to kill whoever followed. Gideon's voice dropped to a quiet whisper. "He's not getting away." Sheriff Nolan nodded. "I'll get the others across downstream." Gideon knelt beside Sable. Her breathing was shallow but steady. "You stay here," Nolan said. But Gideon shook his head. "No." He looked at the dog again. "Not without finishing this." The trail beyond the creek climbed sharply through the mountains. Crow's group had slowed now. The snow grew deeper. Branches snapped underfoot. Eventually, the trees opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a final structure, a hunting lodge, old, weathered. But smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Crow hadn't run. He had chosen to make his stand. Gideon approached slowly. The door creaked open. Inside stood Wyatt Crow. Crow was taller than Gideon remembered from the road weeks earlier. Nearly 6'4" with thick shoulders and a heavy frame shaped by years of physical labor. His dark beard carried streaks of gray, and his deep-set brown eyes held the hard confidence of a man who had spent most of his life believing the law could never reach him. Two other men stood behind him, rifles raised. "You should have stayed out of this," Crow said calmly. Gideon's voice remained steady. "You should have left the dog alone." Crow laughed once. "That mutt cost me half my winter line." Outside, distant engines roared. Sheriff Nolan and the deputies were arriving. Crow heard it too. His confidence faltered. Within minutes, the cabin was surrounded. Rifles lowered, hands raised. The chase was over. Wyatt Crow was finally in custody. But Gideon barely noticed. He stepped outside immediately, back toward the forest path where Sable lay waiting. Snow had begun falling again, soft, silent. Sable lay exactly where he had left her. Her breathing had grown weaker. Gideon knelt beside her in the snow. "Hey," he whispered. Her tail moved faintly, just once, as if to say she knew he had come back. The first thaw came quietly to Briar Glen. In the northern woods of Michigan, winter rarely left with a single dramatic moment. It retreated slowly, like an old monarch surrendering territory piece by piece. Snow softened, then collapsed into clear streams of meltwater. The frozen lakes turned from solid white into glassy blue sheets that cracked under the warming sun. By the time March drifted toward April, patches of earth began to appear beneath the pine trees, and life returned. For Gideon Hart, the changes in the valley were more than seasonal. They were personal. 3 weeks after the night of the capture, the small veterinary clinic in Briar Glen smelled strongly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. The clinic was run by Dr. Meredith Klein, the town's only veterinarian. Meredith Klein was in her mid-40s, tall and lean with a calm, steady presence that put animals at ease almost instantly. Her ash-blonde hair was usually tied into a loose braid that hung over one shoulder, and faint laugh lines rested around her gray eyes. Years earlier, she had worked in a large veterinary hospital in Minneapolis. But after a long divorce and the quiet realization that she preferred mountains to traffic, she had moved north and opened a clinic where half her patients arrived in the back of pickup trucks. She believed animals deserved patience more than perfection. Right now, she was kneeling beside Sable. The German Shepherd lay calmly on a padded mat. her amber eyes half closed while Meredith gently examined her injured leg. "Well," Meredith said after a moment, "that's the best news I've had all week." Gideon stood nearby, arms folded. "She'll run again?" Meredith smiled. "Oh, she'll run." Her fingers pressed lightly along the shepherd's shoulder. The fracture was small, mostly bruising and strain. She glanced at Gideon. "But I'd still keep her from chasing deer for another month." Sable's ears twitched at the word run. Gideon knelt beside her. "You hear that?" he said quietly. "Doctor's orders." The dog lifted her head and nudged his hand with her nose. Meredith watched them with quiet curiosity. "You two seem to understand each other." Gideon shrugged. "She picked me." Meredith chuckled softly. "Dogs have a way of doing that." Outside the clinic, spring sunlight warmed the main street of Briar Glen. Evelyn Pierce leaned against the hood of her truck, arms crossed as she waited. Her chestnut hair moved gently in the breeze, and the light freckles across her nose were more visible now, without the heavy winter scarves she had worn for months. When Gideon stepped outside with Sable walking carefully beside him, Evelyn's face brightened. "Well?" "She'll live," Gideon said. "Good," Evelyn replied. "I was starting to like her." Sable approached Evelyn slowly. Then, after a moment, the shepherd allowed Evelyn to scratch behind her ear. "That's progress." Evelyn laughed. "You trust her?" "More than most people," Gideon said. Evelyn tilted her head thoughtfully. "Fair point." Spring brought more than warmer weather. It brought change. Sheriff Nolan Voss had wasted no time dismantling Wyatt Crow's operation. With the evidence gathered from the cabins and Lucas Hale's testimony, state authorities shut down the entire poaching network within weeks. Illegal traps were removed from the forest. Several men were arrested. And for the first time in years, the northern ridges of Briar Glen felt quieter. Lucas Hale returned to duty as soon as he was cleared by doctors. He looked healthier now, his sandy blonde hair trimmed neatly again, his ranger uniform clean and sharp. But the experience in the forest had left a deeper patience in his eyes. One afternoon, he visited Gideon's cabin. Sable recognized him immediately. The shepherd trotted across the clearing and leaned against Lucas's leg with obvious affection. Lucas laughed softly. "Still looking after me, huh?" He knelt and rubbed the dog's neck. "I owe you more than I can say." Gideon stood on the porch watching. Lucas looked up. "I heard what you did out there," he said. "Crow's crew won't be back anytime soon." Gideon nodded. "Good." Lucas glanced toward the forest behind the cabin. "You know," he said quietly, "those traps injured a lot more animals than people realized." He paused. "Some of them didn't make it." Sable's ears lifted slightly. Gideon followed Lucas's gaze. The woods stretched wide and green beyond the clearing. "Yeah," Gideon said slowly. "I've been thinking about that." A few weeks later, something unexpected began happening. One afternoon, a farmer from the edge of the valley arrived at Gideon's cabin carrying a wounded hound wrapped in a blanket. The dog had stepped into an old steel trap that had been missed during the cleanup. Gideon treated the injury as best he could. 2 days later, another neighbor appeared with a stray terrier that had been wandering near the highway. Then someone brought an injured husky, then another. At first, Gideon simply helped where he could. Temporary shelter, food, basic care. But the animals kept coming. One quiet evening near sunset, Gideon stepped outside the cabin and stopped. Across the clearing stood 6 dogs, not just Sable, 6. A shepherd mix, 2 hounds, a small terrier, and a husky with bright blue eyes. They stood together near the tree line, and strangely, they were all watching the same direction, toward Sable. The German shepherd stood calmly at the center of the clearing. Her posture was relaxed, but confident. For a moment, it almost looked as though the other dogs had gathered around her, as if she were guiding them. Gideon felt something strange stir in his chest. Not confusion, recognition, like watching the beginning of something he hadn't planned. The next day, Evelyn arrived with a solution. She stood beside an old wooden structure behind Gideon's cabin. The building had once been a storage barn decades ago, but the roof sagged and several boards had rotted away. Evelyn folded her arms. "What do you think?" Gideon looked at it. "It's falling apart." "Exactly," she smiled. "Which means nobody will complain if we fix it." "We?" Micah Bell appeared from behind the truck carrying a toolbox nearly half his size. The teenage boy grinned. "I'm the we part." Micah had grown even taller in the past month, though his skinny frame still made him look slightly awkward in oversized work gloves, but his enthusiasm made up for it. Within days, the three of them began rebuilding the old barn. New beams replaced the broken ones. Fresh wood sealed the walls. Lucas Hale even stopped by with spare fencing materials from the ranger station. Slowly, the structure changed. By early May, it had become something new. Not just a barn, a place for animals that had nowhere else to go. Spring deepened. Grass pushed through the last patches of snow. Wildflowers began appearing along the edges of the forest, and the small rescue shelter behind Gideon's cabin slowly filled with life. Dogs barked. Water bowls clattered. Micah spent half his afternoons building new pens and feeding the animals. Evelyn handled supplies and paperwork. Gideon did most of the work quietly, but Sable remained the center of it all. The other dogs followed her naturally, not out of fear, but trust. One evening near the end of May, Gideon stood on the hillside above the cabin. The valley stretched beneath him in soft green waves. Sable ran across the grass below, her stride smooth and powerful again. Her golden coat shone under the warm sunlight. For a long time, Gideon simply watched. When he had stopped his truck that day in the snow, he had believed he was saving a wounded animal, but standing there now, he understood something different. Sable had not been lost in the forest. She had been waiting for someone willing to follow where she led. And sometimes, Gideon thought, the most important choices in life were the quietest ones, like stopping a truck on a snowy road, opening a door, and letting something unexpected climb inside. Sometimes the greatest changes in our lives do not begin with something grand or planned. Sometimes they begin with a small decision in an ordinary moment. A man driving home through the snow could have kept going. The road was long, the day was cold, and the world would never have known the difference. But he stopped. He stepped out of the truck. He chose compassion instead of indifference. And because of that choice, a wounded dog survived. A lost ranger was found. A dangerous crime was uncovered. And an entire valley slowly became a safer place. That is how many miracles in life begin. Not with thunder, not with great signs in the sky, but with one quiet act of kindness. In the Bible, we are reminded that God often works through the smallest moments and the most ordinary people. When we open our hearts to compassion, we sometimes become the answer to someone else's prayer. Perhaps Sable was not just a lost dog wandering in the snow. Perhaps she was a reminder. A reminder that God places moments in our path every day. Moments where we can choose to help, to listen, to care, or simply to stop when others walk by. And when we choose kindness, something beautiful begins to grow. In our everyday lives, we all encounter moments like that. A stranger who needs help, an animal that needs protection, a neighbor who needs encouragement, a simple opportunity to do the right thing when no one is watching. Those moments may feel small, but sometimes they change everything. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder that goodness still exists in this world. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and whether you have ever experienced a moment when kindness changed a life. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps with peace and compassion in the days ahead.